Hey, what's up everyone? Today we have a Husqvarna 266 XP chainsaw. It's a pretty beefy little saw. It's a kind of like a friend of a friend type scenario going on here. And he said that he had this for a little bit of time, and it's getting harder and harder to start. He'll put it down he'll use it for a couple days, no issue, and then maybe a few weeks later he'll try it again and it's completely just tore up. And it takes him like 15 or 20 pulls before it starts to work. Okay. I would usually start it, but he showed it to me when he brought it to me, and exactly what he said. He said he hasn't would have run for like 2 or 3 weeks when he got it to me, and that was about 2 weeks ago. And yeah, it took, I think we counted 17 pulls, and this wasn't these tiny little pulls either. They were normal sized pulls, so that's our problem. So I know it runs. Couple things that I want to go over before we even start. One, do you see a primer bulb on this? Well, let me explain why you don't. Because there isn't one. These chainsaws do not have a primer bulb, and some of them, especially the older ones, they have a liking to have a fairly long fuel line, and the fuel line, when you pull on it, the vacuum of the engine, which is connected to the carb going to the fuel pump, coincidentally, will start drawing that fuel from the tank. Now, in a primer type of carburetor, you are priming it, so you're moving that fuel through the carb, so it's pretty much primed. This one does not have that, so the only way to do that is to make sure your fuel tank is sealed properly. This one is, and to give it a pull. It's going to take some pulls, so if you haven't used it for a while, this is not going to be a one pull saw. It's just not. Steels, if you look at them, they have a fairly short line. There's a reason for that, because it takes less time for that fuel to go through there. This one I haven't looked at, but I'm pretty sure probably has a decent line. I'm guessing 8 inches, probably maybe 10. So it's going to take time for that to go through. Also, having said that, the condition of your engine is going to change this greatly of how long it takes. So if you have enough compression to run and probably run okay, it's going to take more pulls than the saw that has really good compression and has little to no wear on it. When you first get it, yeah, it's going to start no problem, because it's you're pulling the fuel as fast as you possibly can with that saw and ever after that, it's just going to keep on getting a little bit worse, and so on and so forth. The compression on this is enough to get it going. If you pull on the pull cord, it does sink down, but it doesn't sink down very fast, but it also isn't the greatest either, but it should work, and I've heard it runs, so it probably will. And the guy does use this routinely. He just, when it does get started, he just wants to see if we can get it working a little bit better. Also, having said that, that fuel pump that we were talking about very well could be needing to be replaced. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a general carb tune-up, maybe look at the fuel lines, maybe do the fuel lines, maybe the tank needs to be cleaned out. I'm going to look at the seal on that fuel cap one more time. So we're going to pretty much take care of a lot of those other problems that we can fix, compared to the engine problem we don't really want to, or don't really have permission to. So let's go ahead and take a look at that carb. I let the person know what I just told you when he gave it to me. Now, every time someone gives me something, I've already taken this off, by the way. I wanted to look at the carb to get the correct carb kit. But I pretty much tell every person that drops anything off This is what I think it is. This is what it could be in addition. It could be this, this, and this. If it is this, do you want me to fix it, or do you want me to scrap it, or what do you want me to do? I told them that if the engine is just getting a little bit too worn, it's just going to be, you're going to have to live with it. Do you want me to replace the rings, or do you want me to replace the piston? Do you want me to see if it's even worth it? What's going on? He pretty much told me he does not want any, doesn't want to incur the cost of the engine repair. I probably don't need to take that off. And just do enough to get the carb going good, and if that is just how it has to run, that's just how it has to run. Okay. I mean, don't get me wrong, we can buy a new cylinder, we can buy a new piston and rings, but how much money do you want to put in the saw? Now, I was told the word routinely, but I don't know what routinely is to some people. My routinely could be significantly different than someone else's. Like, for instance, I routinely work in my garage, but do I do that 8 hours a day every day? No, I do not. I work maybe a little in the evenings, and a couple hours on Wednesdays and a couple hours on the weekends, and we get some work done. So that's a lot different than someone who works there 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and routinely does stuff like that. Oh yeah, this is that type of one that we have to take off this little cover, if I remember correctly. There's Alan definitely helped out on this case. Vaguely remembered up to 4 that we don't have to take anything apart that we don't need to. So what is this? This is a, I don't know, it's worn off, but it's not very big. Okay, so we have a linkage we're gonna have to remove from this. Is that the throttle? Yes, it is. See if we can just take this cover off, make it easier on ourselves. There we go. So, this part's important. Before you disconnect the fuel line, let me get you a different angle. Make sure that the fuel tank is open. I don't know, that smell doesn't give me the warm and fuzzies that this was used very often. This kind of brings up another story. You know, old gas will burn, but yeah, it's gonna run rough, it's gonna run hard, it's gonna run very dirty. It's probably not gonna wanna run at a very high RPM. So, if you are, I need to get a clamp, because apparently this is full, farther than I imagined it would be. But anyway, you know, new gas is really what these are meant to run on. So even if it's only like, I don't know, last year or something, even though you got the non-ethanol one and everything, just put some new gas in there. That very well could have been a lot of this person's problem. Okay, well, let's take a look at the carb. Took the fuel out, and yeah, it's been in there for a wee bit, so I'm expecting that to be a fairly decent sized problem. Now when I mean, you know, make sure your fuel's good, I don't just mean the tank. In the winter time, that's too big. If you have excess fuel and you know you're not going to be using it because it's winter time and you have your half gallon that you don't want to waste, oh, that wasn't even tight, you know, put it in your car. Don't think it's going to be okay next year because you put stable in it. It's not. It's still old. You might as well get your 7 miles or 15 or whatever your car gets. Just put it in there. And if you don't have anything that you can put it in, give it to a neighbor. The point is, you're going to end up throwing it away anyway. You might as well have someone get a use out of it. And at the end, it's going to cost you more. Because now this guy's going to pay to have this replaced. And to be honest, it very well could have been fixed if you just didn't use old fuel. Now, if you look at here, it's dry. Now, what is that important of knowing? The importance of knowing that is if it had fuel in the carb, it's primed. It's not primed. So, when it's not primed, you have that problem I was talking about where it has to draw fuel in. Now, this is the inlet for the fuel. There's only one in this type of carburetor anyway. And these little passageways are covered by these doors, are kind of act like your fuel pump. Now if these are dirty, hard, plugged, mainly because you were using ethanol fuels or it's been sitting there for a long time, ran it without a fuel filter. I mean, let's think about this. I don't know about you, but every time I ever use the chainsaw, it's usually not clean after I'm done with it. And usually I have to put more gas in it, unless I'm like using it for like 10 seconds. If I'm going to be using it, I'm probably going to be needing to fill it up one or two times. So when you do that, you're introducing dirt and bad. Oh yeah. So you can tell these flaps are rock hard. I can bend them. I mean, technically, can you see the bend? If I go like this on a new one, it will flap back pretty quickly, but that one takes a really, really long time, and it never really goes all the way back. That's trash. Now, some carb kits, in fact, I think the one I have might be one of them, have this little plastic piece instead of a like a diaphragm material. It's like a rubber sheet almost. And those seem to last for a real long time. They're not as, well, the fuel isn't as damaging to them. Obviously not in this carb, but even the diaphragms for some of the Walbros, you can get a ethanol diaphragm, and you can, which is what we're taking off now, you can pretty much remove the issue of it getting hard over time. At least that's their claim. Oh yeah, I see all the dirt and debris. Granted, there is a vent right there, so that would make sense. But remember how I was saying it never is dirty? Or never is clean, excuse me. I mean, dust, and especially sawdust, has a way of finding any weak spot and exploiting it. Okay, this one has a little lip on it, so I'm going to, let's see here, I'm going to take these adjustment screws out. So we have half, one, a little over one. Now we have half, 3/4. Here's another thing. These needles are oftentimes different, so you'll try to screw them in there and they'll screw in there, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to do anything. You see how one is significantly different than the other? Remember the order. That's why I like to put them in the order they come out. Like for instance, I know that I took them out from right here. From my point of view, this one goes in that hole, that one, the one on top goes in the top hole, good to go. Or high is the one that has a more of a taper, and low is the one that has more of a long shaft. Let's take off the needle. Now our old diaphragm is also can make a problem with starting, because if it's so inflexible that it's not allowing a lot of movement and the needle to go up and down, then no matter how much primer you're going to do, it's always just going to have no fuel. This diaphragm isn't horrible, but it's also not good. So I'm going to go ahead and get this in an ultrasonic cleaner and bring you back. Before I put this in a cleaner, hopefully you can tell, but there's sawdust in the filter that's supposed to filter the fuel. So yeah, there's probably some blockage in there. It's good that we're going to clean it, just not replace the consumables. Everything is nice and clean. Everything looks to be good. I scraped off some of the remnants of the old gasket. That's a little hard because you don't really want to go too abrasive on it. You don't want to scratch it. If it's a little staining, that's okay. So I want to talk about carb kits. Something I don't really go over too often. I just say buy the one you need. Well, how do you do that? Well, there's a couple of things you want to look at primarily. The smaller ones are more or less the same as these, so this is pretty broad and fairly generic, but look at the diaphragm, see what's going on with it. Well, for one, we have this little notch that the needle will actually fit into. A lot of them don't have that. A lot of them just press against it. So if you do have that notch, you need to make sure you have one that does. Now, usually there's some type of hole on the side. You need to figure out if there is one, if it's in the right area, and if there isn't, if there is one, that's not too much of a problem. You would just prefer not to have that if you don't have to. So if your kit comes and it fits like 1,000 different things, it has a little hole here, but you don't need that hole, it's not the end of the world, but next time I wouldn't buy that particular carb kit. When you take it off, make sure everything lines up. This one up here does, so we know this, and this that diaphragm does have that little notch, so we know that section is good. Usually you'll get some of these gaskets, those are most of the time the wrong size. You have your fuel pump and the gasket. This is what I was talking about. This is the same as this one. It should do the exact same thing. As you can tell, you can't really see much of anything. When you look at your fuel pump on your old one, you want to make sure all these little doors are the same. This one is. Now I know I got done talking about how the plastic ones are probably better. Sometimes they can leak in my experience. So excuse me, if yours came with a plastic one, you're probably fine. If it did not, wouldn't use it. So we're going to be using the one that came with the kit, but the same type as the one that came with the carb. Now when you put it on, that goes first, and then on goes your gasket. The reasoning behind that is the machine surface on the carb is smooth. That way those doors can function properly. Just make sure there's no contaminants. It appears to be clean. When you clean the carb, if you have an ultrasonic cleaner, I also highly recommend cleaning all these little doors. Because on the back, excuse me, on this door, it will have like holes and areas where fuel will collect, and openings so those flaps can have some movement. So you want to make sure all that is clean and ready. And these don't need to go on very tight either. They just need to be on adequately tight. Don't wrench on them, but you still want to put them on so they're not going to fall off. This does go through some vibration. And there you have it. Now, this is the problem. This is the needle that came with the kit. I don't like using that. I like to use the needle that came with the carb. The reasoning behind that is the smallest of adjustment can cause a big problem. So I don't want to worry about it. If this was a Zama or Walbro, that would be a little bit of a different story, because you can get little kind of like adjustment tools for it, and if you are a little off, it's not very hard to fix it. But this is not a Walbro or a Zama. This is a Tillotson. Maybe Tillotson sells one. I don't know. I don't have one. Okay. So keep that in mind. Something to pay attention to if you're not familiar is how this would end up going on. The gasket is always first, and then the diaphragm. If you put it on backwards, same exact thing with that adjustment I was talking about. It will cause the diaphragm to be a little bit lower, and you will probably have a leak, which is usually not good. That's like this, okay. See, you want to make sure all these holes, there's one right there, and then the rest of them aren't too important. They're just kind of hold it in place, but that one needs to be clean and free. Where did the top go? Oh, right here. Now, if this wasn't a Tillotson, if this was a Zama or a Walbro, they will usually have a code stamped on them. I've always had more success. Usually the code is around here somewhere. I've always had more success with looking at that code while it's on the machine, getting a carb specifically made for that carb itself, than buying one on the internet that says it fits this saw. The reason why is, even though it might have a exploded view. You might have had the same model and everything, unless it is referencing the serial number, which you'll have to look at the serial number on the saw. The carb very well can be different, so you don't want that to happen. You'll get the wrong kit and then you'll just have a delay. Okay, so that is 1/2 and 3/4, a little over. Luckily, in our case on this one, the needles are also different diameters, so it's really hard to get them mixed up. Oh. That would help if I put it in the right place, huh? So we have 1/2 and then 1. In general, they're usually the same height. If one is super long than the other, you might want to look at it again. So I'm going to put this back on the machine and then we'll give it a pull. You know what? Here's something I want to go over real quick as well. Remember how I told you these are usually often wrong? Sometimes they're not, but if you need to use one, that's what you look for. See right there? That is used for the pump. Pressure from the engine will go in there and will move everything that needs to move to really have the necessary action to move the fuel. So if your gasket is blocking that, I'm just going to clean while I do that, it's not going to work. So you look at, do the mounting holes line up? Does that line up? And is the diameter of the throat the same as the gasket? In this case, all 3 of those are the same. This one is getting a little rough, so I'm going to use the new one, and I think it will be better. This one on the other end, however, will not fit all the way on the front, so don't even bother. This is a little bit longer and you'll just be ramming into it with the choke, and you'll be restricting air, so you'll be getting a a decrease in engine performance. Something that I don't generally show too often because it's fairly self-explanatory, but I wanted to show it now, is this is a fuel line that came off. It was originally connected to the carb. That's bad. When I'm pulling on it to replace it, it literally fell off into pieces, about 3 or 4. The fuel has eaten that line. So we need to put a new one in. Now I've taken this line and I've cut about half of it off. The reason why I do that is simple. I take some oil, this is just marble, I'm going to coat it, and put some down there too. And I'm going to try to feed it down into the tank. This sometimes can take a little finesse. And we have to cut it a little bit more off. Just gonna put more of a slit into it. Okay, so now let me show you, hopefully you can see. Hopefully you can see it in there, but that little slit is now popping through. I'm just going to take a long pair of needle nose and pull it on through. Now that's done, we're going to take our cutters. We're going to cut off. Let's pull a little bit more through. Part of the old fuel line. As you can tell, there's some sealant there. I'm going to remove that and put a new gasket. And cut that off. Throw that away. And we need to have a fuel filter that has a weight on it. This one should be good. The reason why it has a weight on there is anyone who's ever used a chainsaw will tell you that generally they go into some sometimes awkward positions, and if the weight isn't on there and the fuel level changes, then it's going to starve for fuel. So now that's done, we want to pull the excess line back until the fuel filter just sits on the bottom and it can move freely throughout the tank. I like that right there. So I'm going to go ahead and put some fuel in there and we'll give it a pull. So let me explain something real quick before we continue. Chainsaws, and more specifically old chainsaws, there's no such thing as a quick service. That fuel line I put on there worked. However, the fuel grommet was damaged. It was old and nasty, so unfortunately, if you lift it up on its side, it's going to leak. So I am taking a steel fuel line, and for the time being, that way at least I can test it properly. I kind of made my own fuel grommet, more or less. There's a hole in the tank that's bigger than the fuel line. I cut this part off with one or two of the little ribs, shoved the fuel line down the center, blew through it to make sure there was fuel going through it, and there is. So it's not a permanent fix, but at least it's going to seal up the tank and I don't have to worry about leaking. Okay, let's turn this on, see what happens. Oh, just spewing fuel. Huh. I didn't show this part, but I apparently forgot to have both the spring on the needle and also forgot to put the diaphragm on the little ridge I was talking about earlier. It's escaping me. So it was flooding over to an exceptionally large amount. Let's give it a pull now. Oh. Maybe a little choke. Well, it's not leaking anymore, so that's good. I'm going to tighten that air filter down. Air filter will give it drag that we'll need sometimes. But let us turn the idle up a little bit. Well, I shouldn't say sometimes, it will always add drag. I'm gonna let it warm up a little bit and then give it a good tune and then bring it back. Okay, so that's the result of about 15 minutes of total runtime. It idled for a good section of that, let it warm up thoroughly, and all I had to do was increase the idle speed screw and then richen the low, and that worked out pretty good. It got to the point where there's no dead spot. I'm going to take it in the back and cut a couple logs. I have a couple pieces of oak that need to be tended to, so that should be good. I'm going to order the fuel grommet, that way it's more of a permanent fix rather than a temporary fix. That should be about it. So now granted, there's a lot of reasons why a chainsaw will have a hard time starting, but if you haven't done a carb tune-up in a long time, this is a good place to start. If you, at the very least, look at your diaphragms and your fuel pump and see if they're hard like this one was. If it is, that's a pretty good indication that you probably have, you know, this problem. And a simple carb kit will definitely get it fixed. Don't be an idiot like I am and completely forget pieces, probably because I was talking. It will save yourself. Hey, so it's the next day. The battery on you died, so I don't exactly know where I left off, but so I wanted to give it a pull the next day because the main purpose was that it was hard to start, and it was running for a good section of time before, and it started just fine when it was warm, but you know, that's not very impressive. So I want to give it a pull when it's cold and see if it's still going to take as many pulls as it was before. Granted, before it would take days for this to go by. I don't really think it's necessary considering the stuff that we pulled out of the carburetor. The diaphragm was hard and everything, you remember. But like I said before, I don't know if it caught it, but I did forget the spring and the put the diaphragm on wrong. So the reason why it's flooding so bad is because the needle was just wide open the entire time, just letting fuel in there. So I got that fixed. Let's give it a pull. The bar is so heavy, it's literally a teeter-tottering, so I have to step on it, which probably isn't a bad thing to do anyway. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. With this style of carb, you do want to, well, with all chainsaws, let me just put that out there, but especially with this style of carb, if you just start revving it and when it's first turned on, the carb is probably not going to have as much fuel in there because it hasn't gone through enough revolutions to pump that fuel in the carb and fill it up appropriately. Like you notice when I tried to rev it up a little bit in the very beginning and it just kind of died. That's the reason why. There's not enough fuel there. It has to go through its revolutions, as well as it being cold. But you can generally rev a cold saw. It's just not a good idea. Okay, so it is almost exactly 24 hours later and it started on the second pull. I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off. If you like what you see, keep watching, subscribe. I'll catch you in the next video and have a good day.